Gosh, thank you for that really lovely introduction. My ma sou trots gewees het, dink ek. It's a tremendous privilege to be with you. 'n Groot voorreg, baie dankie. As you heard, I spend my life really in the world of thinking. Well, I've done that in all sorts of places all over the world, Paris, London, Geneva, Rome, and so on, lots of it in the rest of Africa and Middle East. And really, the reason clients invite me is because they want to think about how they make decisions for the longer term future. And so what I'll share, just a few thoughts. We won't solve all the world's problems in the few minutes that I have, but I'll share just a few thoughts on the nature of investigating the future and how that's different from thinking about today's problems. Is it even worth it? I would say so. I do it for a living. So I've called it strategic foresight, futures thinking options for alternative futures. That's a really important phrase to think about. Alternative futures. I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that. The first thing I'll talk a little bit about is mental models. Mental models, and you can see I've chosen as my icon for that Naomi Campbell, only because she's a model and she's a bit mental. Well, I thought it was funny, but by the way, we say to a lot of our clients, like I know a lot of the problems you've illustrated are serious, but we say to a lot of our clients, it's really not a good idea to take your problems too seriously. This doesn't mean the problems aren't themselves serious. They are, of course, super serious. But it's in the taking that you really make or break it. And if you take problems in a serious way, what happens is your mind goes into a bit of lockdown. And what tends to happen is you perpetuate the past a little bit. And that's why mental models are so important. It's important to note that mental models are not the world. We have a mental model of the future of South Africa. That's not the same as the future of South Africa. That's just the model that we have. That's a really very important distinction. It doesn't mean the model's wrong, but it means it's worth having a look at. So mental models are a representation of the world, as I say there. They're an attempt at sense-making. They're a lens for understanding. If you leave it unchallenged, that's very important. Your mental model becomes the world. You start thinking, and this is a dangerous thing, that you're right. And of course, you could be. But as you'll see, the future presents all sorts of alternatives. And in the same way, the lenses we use to interrogate the future become the future. So let's assume you agree with me for a moment, that the lens that you use to look at the future is in fact the future that you'll have. Then the question you have to ask is the lens that you have the future you want or the future you don't want? And of course, the future we don't want is a lot more powerful because it's terrifying. But the more that becomes your lens, the more you start making that future happen. So you can hear, I work in the world of thinking, mainly because that's a hell of a lot easier than actually doing anything. And it's really based on the idea that your future is the result of the quality of your thinking. And this is easy to prove, right? For a decade here, we had a guy called Zuma, not exactly a theoretical physicist, PhD, and here we are. So it's quite easy to see that the quality of your thinking determines the quality of your future. So you can think about changing the future in a few ways. You can think about it behaviorally. So you could just do other things and your future will change. That's true. You can do it emotionally. You could say, well, feel differently and then your future can change. That's true. I'm really interested in thinking differently, and the main argument for that is that, in our view as futurists, you can't feel your way out of a problem. You have to think your way out of the problem. Churchill, who lived in war times, of course, and now we have Ukraine and Russia, said it like this. He said, the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. So I'm fascinated by the mind. You heard my invention around the mindset index, by which we try to map the way that senior people make decisions. And to have this new thinking, we hear this a lot. I said it with clients all over the world all the time, and the CEO or someone will say, what we need is new thinking. Everyone nods. Of course, on Monday, we'll go back to spreadsheets and reports and PowerPoint presentations. So I thought, well, how would you do that? And here's my sort of three ways of doing it. First thing, to change your thinking is you can change the content of your thinking. What's in the basket of your thinking? And again, if it's the same kind of stuff, you tend to get the same kind of results, of course. It's really, the question is a sort of response to, those 5 most terrifying words for a man. What are you thinking about? It's the content of your thinking. If you can change that, you can probably change your thinking. Then you can change the level of your thinking. So you can think at a sort of task, process, operations level, or you can think more tactically, or you can think more strategically, or you can even think more futuristically. And then you can change the method of your thinking. And by method, we mean that most of us have been trained on analytical thinking, which means we take a problem, break it down into parts, study each part, identify the part that's not working, focus on that, try and improve it. If that doesn't work, break the broken part into further parts, and then see if we can find something else that's the problem. That's one way of doing it. There are other ways, like futures thinking, systems thinking, creative thinking, analytical thinking, design thinking, and a number of others. Of course, you need to have a mind to start off with, otherwise you're not really working with anything. But that's obviously not a problem in a room like this. Our general rule of thumb then, and I really can tell that you are quite a serious audience, aren't you? Anyway, it's your call. Our general rule of thumb, and it is interesting that the other fingers don't have their own rule. Tough crowd. Yeah. Our general rule of thumb is that the first thing is you need some intellectual energy, right? Some intellectual time. Let's just think about that for a moment. How many of you in this room have, like in your Outlook diary, Thursday afternoon, 2 to 4, thinking? Let's imagine you don't. Let's just imagine for a moment you don't. Okay. Then the question is, so where do your decisions come from? Yeah. So a lot of the answer to that will be habit, tradition, a number of other drivers. So we suggest to senior people you need some intellectual time. And about 20% of that time should be on the past, what's already happened. Sometimes it's useful to reflect on that. South Africa is not a particularly futures-oriented country. We're sort of heavily weighted towards the past for various reasons. But we would say about 20% of your intellectual time on the past, 30% on the present, what's going on right now, and at least 50% on what hasn't happened yet. What hasn't happened yet? Why is that so important? Well, in our view of the world, that's the only thing you've got. Yeah? Have you ever been invited to I think this works in Afrikaans, you've been invited to a toekomsbeplanning sessie? Ja, toekomsbeplanning. Watter ander beplanning is daar? You can only plan for one thing. That's the only thing. So this is important to us because otherwise you're kind of repeating old patterns, but I think you get the idea. So the future is a strange science. It's not a traditional science with traditional data. It requires a lot of imagination, but you can learn how to do it. And the first kind of principle we use there is that more than one future is always possible. This is a kind of disturbing idea on the one hand. More than one thing could happen, because it feels a bit uncertain. But the opposite of that is that the future is to some degree subject to design. But more than one future is always possible without exception. And the seeds relevant in your context of those futures already exist today. That's why paying attention is so important. We know that lots of things are possible, it's complex and it's multifactorial. And we're very interested in the idea of wicked problems, complex problems, opaque problems, and so on. And if you think I'm making it all up as I go along, that is only partially true. A lot of this is borne out in scientific research. Here's a journal article on corporate foresight, for example, and its impact. And the results are astounding. Don't go and read the article. Spoiler alert, here's the conclusion. Entities that look at the future consistently outperform entities that don't look at the future. That's it. So that poses an interesting question to the entity of South Africa. I'm a member, as you heard, of the National Planning Commission. So if you don't really look at the future, and you think the future is essentially going to be just a variety of the past, well, what does that mean for how you compete against other countries, for example? Lots of questions to pose. From a strategy point of view, we can sort of ask, well, how is strategic foresight different from traditional strategy? Here's the single biggest difference. In traditional strategy, you have a kind of as is to be state. As is to be state. Sort of where are you right now, and then what's the ideal state? The ideal state. Or the intended state. I was in Saudi Arabia about 3 years ago, and I was writing on a flip chart and was trying to explain this idea, and I wrote at the bottom of the page, this is the as-is state, and then I drew a little arrow, and I used the abbreviation for an intended state or ideal state. The crowd remains tough, I have to say. Explain to him. Okay. I've got other slides, maybe those work. So, always more than one future possible, otherwise you get into a strategy session like this. I know this is true because I facilitate a lot of them at a bush lodge. So you can't predict the future. As Niels Bohr famously said, it's very difficult to predict things, especially the future. You can't predict it, but what you do know is that when you look at the future changes. That's a really interesting idea. Just think about it. When you look at the future changes. If you don't look at the future, here's kind of my punchline. If you don't look at the future, you end up in the future that someone else has created for you. Think about it like this. How high, let's get more practical here. I've been accused of many things, but never of being a practical man. But let's get practical for a moment. Let's imagine how high your butt is off the ground at the moment. Maybe not something you think about a lot, but let's just imagine how many centimeters you'd guess that is. Let's say, 57 centimeters or something like that. Okay. To what degree, just think about it like this. This is something maybe you've just discovered. But what I find really interesting is that about 4.5 years ago, actually looking at them maybe 6 years ago, the guy who designed the chair already knew that on 3 March 2022, your butt height will be about 57 centimeters. You're only discovering it now. You're living in this world as if this is just the way the world works. This is just normal. But there was someone in the past who sat down and thought, I wonder how high I'd like their butts to be. Someone spent time on this. They designed your future. And here you are. Here you are. So when you look at the future, you start wondering, well, what else is possible? When you don't look at the future, you end up in the future which someone else thought about. That's a very important strategic competitiveness idea. Okay. It's tough, right? It's really tough because we have the weight of the past. Just think how heavy that weighs in South Africa. The past weighs really heavily here. We have the pull of the future. We heard from Bayer and Koteva and these guys about what's possible, that pull of the future. And then you have the kind of the push of the present, sort of, come on guys, there is so much potential here. There are so many silly mistakes. So many of the stakeholders are making. So it's tough to get yourself kind of into that future space. And one of the reasons it's tough is I work, as I say, mainly in the world of thinking and decision making. One of the reasons it's so tough is that you can only ever make a decision in the present. Even if you make it tomorrow, it'll be the present. Why is that a problem? Well, because the present is noisy. It's a raserige besigheid. It's full of politicians and media and, disappointed people who want your attention. But it's the only time you've got to make the decision. Then what do you base it on? Well, for most people, the answer to that question is obvious. You base it on the past. Am I the only one seeing my slides? No, they are up there. Okay. What do you base it on? You base it on the past, of course. But what are you making the decision for? Well, that's a bit weird, isn't it? So you make it in the present, you base it on the past. And by the way, the past is that way. It's strange, isn't it? The past is over. No one says, no, that's the future. The past is over there. We have a really strange conception of time as humans, don't we? You can see that it's made up. It's all made up. Let me give you an example. Let's get practical a minute. Let's say that you get an email later today that says, next Wednesday, you have a meeting at 12 o'clock. Next meeting you have a Wednesday, you have a meeting at 12 o'clock. Then just immediately after that, you get another email that says, the meeting has now been moved forward by 2 days. Same time. On what day is the meeting now? Does anyone feel it's on a Friday? Does anyone think it's on a Monday? There are a lot of people not going to this meeting. That is. But what can we deduce from this in-depth experiment? Well, even our conception of time is not universal. This just shows you how much there is for development. Let's get back to my fascinating slide. I can tell you're all glued to it. So serious. So you're making it in the present, it's noisy. It's a klomp geraas. You're basing it on the past. But where are you going with this? The future. So that's strange, right? Of course, the past is important. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the future is the only thing you've got. I've kind of made that point. And now you can think about that future in a few ways. One of the ways, the two simplest ways, are to say what could happen and what should happen. What could happen, we call those explorative futures. What could happen? And all sorts of things could happen. All sorts of things with various kind of varieties. Now, of course, you have to say, well, what do I think should happen? Otherwise, I'm just going to end up in that future and then moan about how bad it is, right? What should happen? So you can do that in a few ways. You can either look at these various futures and say, well, if this happens, then that's what I want. Or if that happens, then I want something else. Or, if you're really kind of influential and powerful and wealthy and charismatic and so on, you could say, well, I prefer this future, so I'm going to do something to increase the probability, no certainty, increase the probability that that happens. Or if you're really spectacularly creative and innovative, you can just create your own future. In a sense, the establishment of Graan SA is a good example of inventing your own future. It's weird that when we sit inside the present, we think that's just the way the world works. But when you start thinking about it, you realize the world's been designed to make it work the way it does today. What that tells us is that the future is subject to the same kind of design. Okay, so the past is important, and there we do look at things like origins. Where do grains come from? Patterns. How do guys in the grain industry behave? Attitudes. What do they like? What do they not like? Traditions. How do they celebrate? What are their rituals? Culture and cultures, both ethnic and institutional. What happens all the time? And then habits. What do they do again and again and again and again? I'm particularly interested in the idea of a thinking habit. The reason I'm so interested is that one definition of a habit is that a habit is something that you do without thinking. So if you accept that definition, then what is a thinking habit? Well, it's when you think that you're thinking, but when you think about it. So all sorts of futures are possible, and we can arrange them in various ways. The one kind of future is what we call the projected future or the current future. This is the future that happens if you keep going the way you're going right now. Yeah? Did your parents also say that to you when you were a teenager? Keep going the way you're going right now, and you could be working and thinking in the future. Of call that the projected future. It's kind of keep going like this, and let's paint what that looks like. Okay. Well, then you come back to today, and you say, well, how excited am I about that? It's a bit depressing, this one. Unless you're super healthy and, doing amazing things. This one is a bit kind of, gain 1 or 2 kilograms a year in 20 years. What is that picture? This is what this is about. It's important to note that the current future is not the same as the current. The current future is an intensified version of the current. So keep talking to those people, not those. Keep investing here, not there. Keep reading this, not that. And there you are. So what we help companies to do is we paint that picture. So what does that look like? And I can tell you it's a fist fight. It's not something a lot of companies want to look at. Then we come back to today and we say, well, okay, so what else is there? What else have you got? What else have you got? Well, one of the options is what you might call a preposterous future. It's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. Maybe it's too far out, just too ludicrous to even think about. Another version is what you might call the possible future. So we're sort of getting from the realm of ridiculousness, and I'm really not one of those futures who are telling you the robots are coming and they're going to take your jobs. I'm much more interested in the probability because I work with real companies, with real strategies. What's possible? And once you walk around the realm of possibility, and I don't mean in an Oprah Winfrey sort of way, I mean in a kind of fairly realistic sort of way, right? What do you see now? And that starts to help you to reevaluate your current future. Then we get into which futures are more probable. Which future is more probable? Let me warn you here that the way that people normally think about this is that the fumbling along version of the present is the most probable. That's how most people think about probability. I'm just going to fumble along the way I do it now with a few variations. That's the most probable. Okay. But then we're curious in what we call plausible futures. With plausible futures, basically the test question is, tell me the story of how this happens. How does this play? Tell me the story. How does it work? Yeah? It's almost like, it's a very unromantic question, It's like when you say to a girl, I'll swim the deepest river, climb the highest mountain for you, you'll be happy forever. Tell me the story of how this actually plays out. Yeah, so you'll climb the highest mountain, swim the deepest river, but not wash the dishes. That's too far. So plausible futures, you need to be able to tell the story of how this is actually going to happen. And that's very useful to get you away from hysteria and to get you away from kind of delusion, self-delusion. So we're particularly interested as strategists in preferable futures. What's the future you want? The future you want. Now, for audiences with a sense of humor, I might have said, as illustrated by that famous group of philosophers from the 1990s, the Spice Girls, who were interested in what you really, really want. But for this audience, I'm just going to move along. Some of you will remember this product. This is from, for the young people, let me explain. In the 1980s, there was electricity supply was really variable. Some things don't change into the future. People didn't have milk consistently, so a global company called Nestle came up with this thing, which is basically baby powder for adults. And there's a very famous advert that the company used to educate the local population. You might remember, some of the older folks, there's a gentleman at the fridge. He's looking for the milk. He gets very angry and upset. This is often a sign of a low intellect, quick to anger. Gets very frustrated very quickly. Low intellects don't have the patience for searching. Get very frustrated very quickly. He runs out of patience very quickly, even though he's got only half a cubic meter to work with, can't find it. But he's so convinced from patterns of the past that it must be in there. So, what does he do? Ask the advice of the consultant in the bedroom. She is obviously a superior intellect. She can hear the frustration. She senses, I've married badly. It ends in divorce. They don't show the whole movie, they just show a little scene where she says, listen, you idiot, it's not inside. He's not satisfied with the answer. Low intellect, not used to learning new things. Frustrated, he repeats what she's just said. It's not inside. Eventually he has to concede. It's didn't win an Oscar award, but I think it taught us an important lesson that we call exospection. Basically, it means it's not inside. So what does that mean? Well, why is that so important? Because the difference between strategy and foresight and how that's different from traditional MBAs is that in a traditional MBA and on Oprah Winfrey, you learn you need to look inside yourself. Have you ever heard that? Starts with you. We would say it is extraordinarily unlikely that it would start with you. Don't take it personally. Don't look at me in that tone of voice. I don't mean it personally. It's a simple mathematical probability. Let me give you a multiple choice question to prove this. You ready? I'm going to give you two options, option A and option B. Okay, option A, it starts with you. Sounds good? Option B. It starts with any one of the other 7.6 billion people on the planet. Which one is more probable? I'm not saying it can't start with you. It's just a probability game. Is it you? Or is it one of the others? You have to acknowledge that speaking purely mathematically, I'm not factoring in what your mother told you growing up at this stage. It's pure intellectual probability. I know you're special and all of that. Why is that important? Because it means you have to look outside. It's not inside. Unless you're in an alien movie. But apart from that, it's probably going to come from the outside. And if you look at technology disruption, you can see it time and time and time again. Yahoo discovers search, and of course you all have a Yahoo account, right? No, you don't. You have a Google account. Google takes over the world, so surely must be the platform for networking. No, that's not true. That comes from LinkedIn. LinkedIn's already connecting everyone. Surely they will win the short version of the conversation. No, that's Twitter. So, it's not inside. Which is why it's so enormously encouraging to have sat here, and it's been a tremendous privilege, listening to you looking outside, listening to what people from the rest of the world are doing, what some of the scientists are doing. That's an important principle, and I think that could take us a long way. South Africa also suffers a little bit from exceptionalism. Ja, exceptionalism. Ja, South Africa is 'n ander plek. It's ander reëls, ander dinge geld. Yeah, kind of. In a way. Okay, it's not inside. So you can think about your design of the future in a few ways, and maybe I'll get close to the end with this. So I did some work on the extent to which you might design the future with the future in mind. So in other words, two ideas, the idea of design, the idea of the future. And there's a sort of level where you're not really designing the future and you're not really designing it, and actually there's very little future conversation. So no design, no future. In other words, yesterday's design and mainly oriented towards history. There's nothing wrong with that. As futurists, we have many faults, but living in the past isn't one of them. There's another level beyond that where you're not really designing anything, but you are starting to pay attention. You're just noticing. This is happening, this minister's saying this guy's doing this. It's sort of reading the newspapers, right? And commenting on it. So there's still not much design. and very little future, but at least we're in the present now. A level up from that is what you might call design-free prediction. This we hear a lot. The more alcohol people have, the more willing they are to explore this. Although there's an inverse trap there, the more alcohol they have, the fewer options they can see about the future, and towards the end of the evening, there's basically one thing. Have you noticed that? Starts off broadly. After about 7 tots, it's one thing. And they show you, by a show of the fingers, how many things they can tolerate in their intellect at that time. So what's happening here is, I'm just predicting, I'm saying this is what's going to happen. Yeah? The whole world is going to fill in your thing after 7 tots. Okay, you know you do this. The next level up is what you might call design against the future. So in other words, there's a future going to happen, but you're sort of working on the revival of the typewriter or something. You know, because maybe it's your grandfather had a typewriter business. So you're kind of working really hard, you're designing things. It's not like you're lazy, it's got nothing to do with the future. That can be a bit depressing also. Because it's not, often we're told work hard and things will work out well. The Dominee already told us this morning what utter nonsense that is. Okay, so you can design your world against the future. You can design despite the future. So what you're doing here is, it's not like you're fighting the future. It's not like you've decided, I can see the world's going this way, I don't like this. You're sort of tolerating the fact that there's a future, but you're designing your world despite the future. Yeah, the world may be going this way, I'm going a different way. That's your right. A little bit more future-friendly is design what you might call towards the future. So you go, okay, fine. There's going to be a future. I'm going to start thinking about that stuff. Maybe nudge myself a little bit. You know, maybe there's going to be a future. By the way, very high probability. Next level up is what you might call design for the future. What's going on here is you're curious about the future and you're organizing yourself in favor of the future, right? This is, I would say, an advisable thing to do. Given that this is happening anyway, of course it's not the worst idea in the world. If you're really kind of into this stuff, there's what you might call design with the future. So it's you and the future, hand in hand, all the time, reflecting on what's coming, small stature corn or whatever it is, and designing with that all the time. Every time you have to make a strategic decision, you're sort of hand in hand with the future. Another level up, this is kind of the ultimate level. This is the Checkers ShopRite Championship Boerewors model. It's designed by the future. Yeah, that's a great, anyone from ShopRite? That's just the brilliant design. So they've got all these amazing food scientists. They could design an amazing wors. It's not what they do. What they do is they ask people to design it. Then they have regional competitions. Then they have it on Sevendelaan. And then there's a winner who wins the ultimate prize, a large white 4x4. That's designed by the future. You're allowing the future to tell you what to do. And if you're sort of Elon Musk, and you're really wealthy and really influential and really charismatic and intelligent, you can design the future. You can create an intelligent alternative future, which to some degree you've already done here. So you could sort of decide in your business where you think you are. And the reality is, with some products and services, you'll be higher than others, right? Some of them haven't had redesign for the last 10 years. You've been sort of hoping for the best. Some of them you've kind of been fighting the future, but you're paying attention to it. And some of them you're kind of reinventing the future. Okay. So David Bohm, the famous physicist, says it like this, if I may repeat this. The reason why we don't see the source of our problems, that the means by which we try to solve them is the problem. In other words, he's repeating the idea that the lens is the challenge. So, colleagues, I think what I'm trying to illustrate to you is an exploration of the future is the difference between seeing that and seeing that. Driving your car like that or driving your car like that. Now, you could say, listen, this is my car. I own this car. I inherited this car. I know how to drive this car. What business is it of yours? What's going on the outside? Well, you can see why companies do this work. It's a risk mitigation approach, and it's a strategic opportunity access approach. Yeah? It's important to note that the methodology is not the problem. So think about it like this. There you are, you're driving, you're switching the lights on. It's important to notice the lights that you switched on did not make the other car. Yeah? So when we work with companies and we say, well, when you look at it and you see this thing, you're driving along the road, switch on the lights, see a kudu in the road, the lights didn't make the kudu. Of course, you can switch off the lights and go, not my problem. This is my car. Yeah? Don't talk to me. These are the boundaries of what I own. I'm in charge here. Okay. Did you know that by 2017, only about 16% of the Fortune 500 companies of the 1980s were still on the list? This is what we're talking about here, because that's the difference between driving like that and driving like that. So let me conclude, perhaps, colleagues, on a few seeds of hope. I really love that photograph from the riots in July. That's without the heading. Did you see that photograph? I'm not really a nationalist, but I was pretty proud to be a South African when I saw taxi drivers do that. That was impressive stuff. And the heading I put on there is from the last 48 hours, Ramaphosa appoints new state security agency head and some key new appointments. By the way, Majola is a former Deputy Minister of Energy and was South Africa's ambassador to Senegal, Mauritania, Cape Verde, Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau. How do I interpret that as a futurist? Well, to me, that's really interesting because it's international. Let me explain it like this. When Jacob Zuma became the president, the first thing he did is went straight to KZN. There's a reason, right? When Ramaphosa became the president, the first thing he did is go straight to Davos. That's the story. That tells you the story. That tells you the difference. Because Ramaphosa is taking the Cremora. So I thought it was particularly fascinating that Majola became the new state security agency. That's the Cremora. And that brings a perspective which we haven't had for a very long time. Okay, I do suffer from some optimism, but nobody's perfect. A few seeds of hope, colleagues. The first is an active citizenry in a civil society. We still have people really curious about the future of this country. Not from a nationalistic perspective, just from a kind of really interesting, curious, optimistic, basic salt-of-the-earth goodness kind of people. And you can see it in institutions. Several high-quality civil society institutions on the move. I'm part of some of them. The next is media freedom. To me, that's a really, really interesting one. Section 16 of our Constitution. You can report on anything. We have the media here today. That is an astonishing thing. This is not something you can do in Russia. So the media can come in here, They can make sense or try to make sense of what's been going on there, and they can put it out there. That's an astonishing thing. Any one of us can write something in the media. I said on radio, when all the journalists were being fired from the SABC a few years ago for attacking the government, I said, in my scientific opinion, Jacob Zimmer's an idiot. In the media. Nothing happened, as far as I know. Maybe some of my cousins got kidnapped or something, I don't know. But I've been hoping for that anyway. So we have this astonishing media freedom. And by the way, if I may be so utterly bold, this is something you suck at. You're not using this strategic opportunity. You're not using this freedom. Why am I being a little bit deliberate? Because as a strategist, ladies and gentlemen, I only have one objective, and that is, I want you to win. That's the only thing I'm interested in. So what that means is you have to use every single strategic opportunity available to you. And you have to, when you compare yourself to the rest of the world, start with the assumption that life is unfair, and then immediately ask, how is it unfair in my favor? And this is a good example of that. The next sign of hope to me is an independent judiciary. We've just heard Majola being appointed. We've just heard Mantashe. Just think about what's going on. Zondo didn't make it for the top job. Comes out, says, here's my report. Mantashe, by the way, he's involved in Bosasa. Firstly, media freedom. Incredible, right? That you can say that in a country like this. And that the judiciary can publish this. This is our finding. I think that is an amazing bit of bulwark, bit of security, bit of upheld democracy that we've been able to hang on to in South Africa. I'm not saying it's not under threat, but it has somehow managed to survive. A few more. Academic freedom. I love this one. I always talk about this one around the world. I say to people, put up your hand if your constitution in your country explicitly says, we'll protect academic freedom. It's an astonishing right to have. One other thing, just think about what this means. Provided you're ethical, that's very important, provided you're ethical, you can study anything. You can investigate anything and subject it to scientific scrutiny. Anything. And then provided you are ethical and you use proper science, you can publish what you discovered. That is an astonishing right to have. So when the government says agriculture works best like this, you can subject that to scientific research. And if you find it's a load of rubbish, you can then publish it. And because of media freedom, you can put it in the media. And you can study your own proposal for the future. That's the future you want. Subject that to scientific scrutiny and publish that. That is astonishing. That is amazing. That is really playing with Cremora. And by the way, I think this is one of the benefits, but it's terrible to talk about this, it's too early maybe, of COVID. That we suddenly in South Africa had on television scientists. When was the last time you saw that? A scientist on TV. The last time I saw that was Beyond 2000. Remember that? Beyond 2000. That's what made me think futures. That's what I'm going to get into. We had scientists on television. Why is that so important? Because it's a signal. It's a signal that it's not dead yet, but the ideology conversation is doing this. There are still people who make a living out of ideology, so it's not going to go away. The ideology conversation is doing that, and the science conversation is doing this. So I was very disappointed by Mkhize, Anyway, the next one, I'm almost done, is we have a highly sophisticated business sector. highly sophisticated. You heard that yesterday, and we can see it in the room here. People who are really savvy, who can pivot, who are agile, who have thorough business training, decent business practice, internationally benchmarked. Here we're doing very well. By the way, professional management in South Africa, judged by the Global Talent Competitiveness Index, which is published by INSEAD and the World Economic Forum. I worked with them a little bit. South African professional management rates in the top 26 on earth. On earth. Now, we have an education discrepancy, I'll give you that. But if you get into some kind of professional management role, you're probably in the top 30 countries in the world. Which is an odd phrase. Where else would the countries be? Why should you specify? I'm referring specifically to countries only in the world. I don't know. I'm going to keep trying. It's almost over despite the audience. Okay. The next one here is an internationalization paradigm. In other words, this is the Cremora stuff I've been talking about. So we have Majola now. We have Ramaphosa. I can tell you in the NPC, in the presidency, the quality of the people are just absolutely astonishing. There's an international paradigm here. What do I mean by this? It means that South African exceptionalism, the story that we are different and therefore different special rules should apply to us, is diminishing. And COVID helped with that. Yeah? If this happened before the internet, in Uganda, in the 1940s, then COVID would have been described as some evil from the West. Well, that time has changed. We're looking outside now. And then, finally, a hyper-dynamic agricultural sector, including this astonishing, everyone's been talking about this astonishing penchant, this tendency for the South African agricultural sector to be an early adopter of technology for experimental purposes. That stands us, ladies and gentlemen, in tremendously good stead. So, dear colleagues, an investigation of the future, I argue, is therefore no longer optional. It's not some fancy thing that corporate companies do in the rest of the world. It's not a luxury. An investigation of the future and the innovation required to compete in the future is now essential, a matter of survival. Investigating that future takes a little bit of discipline. Much of the seeds for that already exist, and we saw that over the last 2 days. Making new connections by looking outside and asking new questions does, I think, present us at least with a spectre of opportunity for an alternative future. In addition to the enormously high competence we have in this sector, in this room, we have some interesting dots on the horizon that are slowly starting to shift. And I don't mean a kind of Pollyanna optimism that everything will be great. I mean a discerning, attentive, strategic review of where we are. Those opportunities are available certainly to the astonishing people we have in this room. And I'll leave you with a thought in my final attempt, desperate as it is for a giggle from the audience, with the words of the Hollywood comedian George Burns. For the young people, by the way, George Burns was the first guy in comedy to introduce 3 things. He realized for the rhythm of a comedic observation, you need 3 things. You know, like a priest, a rabbi, and a minister, or a nun, a doctor, and a patient, or something like that. By the way, in stand-up comedy, you have a very interesting kind of phenomenon over the last 15 years of innovation. And one of the things that stand-up comedy came up with is the idea of vujade, which is really important for innovation. You can see I've discovered new energy in my talk. I've just realized I've got so much time. Vujade. You're all familiar with the idea of déjà vu? from the French scene before. Yeah? You come into a situation and go, I don't know, I think I've seen this. A stand-up comedian in London a few years ago introduced this idea of Vujade, which doesn't mean anything, but it's a silly idea, and it just means this idea. It means that it's not that I come across the situation, I think, well, I've seen this before. I come at the situation as if it is the first time I've ever seen it. It's a really interesting intellectual technique. It's one of the reasons why immigrants often outperform locals in innovation research. Think about South Africa. Guys from Ethiopia or wherever it is come in, and then South African people, they're taking our jobs. Listen, if someone who isn't here legally cannot speak the local language and has no money beats you, maybe you suck. You got the same thing in America, right? The Mexicans are taking it. It's the same argument. Someone had to burrow a hole through the ground, can't speak the language, hasn't got a bank account, and still wins. So Vujade is this idea, you come at the situation as if it is the first time you've ever seen it, like you would with, I don't know, with your wife. Maybe I've told you some of that. Before you're at a party and you see your wife sort of across the room and she's talking to a guy. And, so first you review the guy, the watch, the clothes, all of that stuff. And then you look at her reaction, right? And one of the warning signals, as you well know, is, how attentive is she towards the person? And you're really in trouble when she executes the double tuck. If you're not familiar with this, it looks like this. When that happens, it's time to move in. That's an important signal from the future. Why is that? Why am I telling you this story? Because suddenly you're thinking of your wife in a different way. It's like, maybe that's an attractive woman. So strategic opportunities present themselves a little bit like that. So if you come at the situation as if it is your first day, and sometimes you ask different questions. When you do that, different answers emerge. Some of them risks and some of them opportunities. So after that tangent, I'll bring you back to George Burns, who famously said, I look to the future because that's where I'm going to spend rather a large part of the rest of my life. You've been very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you.